Vietnam and the New Rights Revolution. Lecture terms: Vietnam and the New Left. Focus question: how did the Vietnam War transform American politics and culture? The new definition of, quote, left. The rise of a white youth student movement was a surprise to many. Colleges had been, for a long time, very conservative institutions that drew their students from the privileged strata in American society, and few thought college students in the 1960s had anything to complain about. But student definitions of freedom, as they took form in a critique of the mainstream values in the institutions, birthed a protest movement that came to be called the New Left. What made the New Left new was its rejection of the political and intellectual categories that had shaped radicalism and liberalism for most of the 20th century. It challenged mainstream America and the old left of the 1930s and 1940s. Unlike the Communist Party, it did not see the Soviet Union as a model society or view the working class as the main agent of social change. Not language of economic equality and social citizenship, but the language of loneliness, isolation, alienation, and powerlessness in a bureaucratic society whose affluence denied authenticity, characterized New Left expression. The baby boom produced a mass generation influenced by these ideas, as more than 7 million attended college by 1968. This was a natural progression of the earlier counterculture and beat movement. The New Left ultimately had roots in the American Revolution and the critique made by the abolitionists of the gap between American values and realities. It was inspired by the cultural radicalisms of the 1910s and the 1950s. But its most immediate inspiration was the Black Freedom Movement. The 60s, a decade of political, racial, and cultural turmoil, was born of claims made by those who felt excluded from society, from Southern and urban blacks to middle-class students. Both the Black movement and the white New Left movement shared the belief that evils were deeply embedded in America's institutions and could only be resolved through direct confrontation. A fading consensus. In 1962 and 1963, books appeared that challenged the 1950s consensus reality. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time captured the anger of blacks. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring showed the environmental costs of economic growth. And Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities criticized the urban renewal and highway construction that made cities larger and less diverse, and thus less livable and socially interactive. But in some ways, the most influential critique came in 1962 from a small group of liberal and radical college students, Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. Their Port Huron statement, composed at Port Huron, Michigan, criticized American institutions, including political parties, cooperations, unions, and the military-industrial complex. But the document inspired new student radicalism with its vision of social change. The statement's authors called for the creation of a democracy of individual participation, where the, quote, individual shares in those social decisions determining the quality and direction of his life. Freedom for the New Left meant, quote, participatory democracy. This rather vague standard was used to judge existing social arrangements, and workplaces, schools, and governments were found to be deeply flawed and undemocratic by this group. The New Left rejected a society run by experts, the dream of the progressive generation. SDS grew quickly, and in 1964, events at the University of California at Berkeley revealed the power of the student movement. This university, an immense and bureaucratic Cold War institution, imposed a new rule that banned political groups from using a central area of the campus to distribute ideas and literature. This sparked massive protests. Students, including conservatives, created a movement for free expression as a result. Protest leaders likened the university to a knowledge factory and encouraged students to break the machines. Massive protests for months, known as the free speech movement, caused the university to rescind its ban on free expression. America and Vietnam. The Vietnam War transformed Black and New Left protests into a generational rebellion. The Vietnam War, a logical extension of Cold War assumptions and policies, demonstrated the danger of treating the world and every local situation through a simple anti-communist lens. Few Americans, even policymakers deciding to go to war, knew much at all about Vietnam's history or culture. Cold War administrations viewed a complex national liberation struggle led by homegrown communists who had broad popular support there and Soviet backing as a test of, quote, containment. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations had supported France's failed efforts to retain Vietnam as a colony, but then cast their lot with the South Vietnamese government in violation of Geneva Accords that had promised elections to unify North and South Vietnam. The reason why is the U.S. feared that they would vote to unite under communism, and the containment policy kept us from allowing that. By the 1960s, the United States supported N. Dinh Diem's brutal and corrupt regime in the South, ultimately because he was not a communist. Fears that voters would not forgive them if they, quote, lost Vietnam, made Kennedy and Johnson reluctant to remove U.S. aid and forces from Vietnam without a true victory. Kennedy's advisors saw Vietnam as a test of whether the United States could successfully conduct counterinsurgencies, interventions against internal uprisings in non-communist countries, in order to stop Third World revolutions. But U.S. advisors in Vietnam, aiding Diem's government, could not check the progress of the communist-led Viet Cong insurgency. And in October 1963, after large Buddhist protests against Diem's regime, the United States approved a military coup that led to Diem's death. Johnson's War. Lyndon Johnson took office with little experience in foreign relations. While reluctant to send U.S. troops to South Vietnam and fearing interminable involvement, he felt that, quote, losing Vietnam would deliver electoral advantages to Republicans. In August 1964, North Vietnamese boats encountered an American ship on a spy mission off North Vietnam's coast. When the boats fired on the U.S. vessel, Johnson claimed the United States was a victim of aggression. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the president to take measures to defend U.S. forces in Vietnam. Only 2 senators voted against the resolution, the nearest the United States came to declaring war in this conflict, and it passed without any discussion of U.S. goals or strategy. In the 1964 election campaign, Johnson said he did not intend to send U.S. troops to Vietnam. Advised to do so after the proper provocation, he launched airstrikes against North Vietnam and sent U.S. ground troops to the south when the Viet Cong, in early 1965, attacked a U.S. air base. By 1968, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were at war in South Vietnam. U.S. forces bombed North and South Vietnam with more tonnage than was used by all sides in World War II. U.S. ground forces ruthlessly hunted the Viet Cong in search and destroy operations that left villages burned and many civilians killed. But the might of the U.S. military did not break the Viet Cong insurgency or its North Vietnamese support. Simultaneously, Johnson sent U.S. troops to the Dominican Republic, where military leaders tried to restore the rule of Juan Bosch, the left-wing but non-communist president, who in 1963 had been removed from power by a military coup against him. Johnson dispatched troops to quell unrest and ensure that Bosch would not return. With rising casualties and the massive bombing of North and South Vietnam, the Cold War consensus began to disintegrate. By 1968, the war had sidetracked much of the Great Society and divided families, universities, and the Democratic Party. With both liberal and conservative political leaders committed to the war, young activists lost all confidence in the political system altogether. Opposition to the war united all kinds of grievances and discontent with American society in general. With college students exempted from the draft, the fighting of the war fell to poor and working class draftees. In 1967, even Martin Luther King Jr., a one-time ally of President Johnson, condemned the war for its violence and its diversion of resources away from America. To SDS, the war seemed to epitomize the antithesis of participatory democracy, since U.S. intervention had risen from secret commitments and decisions made by political elites with no real debate. SDS organized the first major anti-war demonstration, which occurred in Washington, D.C. in April 1965. And from there, protests spread across the country. By 1967, young men were burning their draft cards and fleeing to Canada to avoid fighting what they believed to be an unjust war. In October 1967, as many as 100,000 anti-war protesters converged on the Pentagon. The continuing rise of counterculture. During the 1960s, Americans' definition of freedom grew to include cultural freedom. The war was a central cause of the generational rebellion called the counterculture. By the late 1960s, millions of young people rejected their elders' values and behavior. Their ranks included not just college students, but young workers, even though most unions strongly condemned anti-war protests and the counterculture. For the first time in American history, the repudiation of respectable norms in clothing, language, sexual behavior, and drug use became the foundations of a mass movement. Much of the counterculture, such as colorful clothes, rock music, and images of sexual freedom, were easily turned into mass-marketed goods, even though, ostensibly, they represented a rejection of mass consumer culture. But self-indulgence and self-destruction were built into the counterculture. Countercultural icons like Timothy Leary urged young people to take hallucinogenic drugs like LSD to, quote, turn on, tune in, and drop out. Yet the counterculture was more than just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Personal liberation represented a rebellion against and release from bureaucratized education and work, repressive behavioral norms, and a militarized state that wreaked destruction on distant lands. It encouraged new forms of radical action. Quote, underground newspapers pioneered a highly personal and political journalism. The Youth International Party, or Yippies, injected human spectacle into protests, in one instance throwing dollar bills from the visitors' gallery onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, halting trading as brokers scrambled to grab the money. The counterculture established havens in cities like New York, in the East Village, and San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. 2,000 communes were established in rural areas throughout the nation as well. The Woodstock Music Festival in upstate New York in 1969 brought hundreds of thousands of young people together who were welcomed with the first song by Richie Havens, who began it by repeating a single word: freedom. Above all, the counterculture centered on the free individual, nowhere more than in sexual freedom. The birth control pill had separated sex from reproduction and allowed, quote, free love to flourish. Religious conviction helped to inspire the civil rights movement, but a different religious development, the sweeping reforms of Vatican II, initiated in the Roman Catholic practice, such as religious mass delivered in local languages instead of Latin, led many priests, nuns, and lay Catholics to become involved in social movements. This created a growing split in churches between liberals and conservatives. Additionally, the quest for personal authenticity, a feature of the counterculture, led to a flowering of religious and spiritual creativity and experimentation in a variety of ways by members of various religious communities and denominations. For example, some Americans traveled to Tibet and India seeking spiritual guidance from gurus, who were religious teachers there. More sinister cults also emerged during this connection of the counterculture with religious activity. These groups, instead, based their community norms on single-minded devotion to a charismatic leader, often with tragic outcomes, like that of followers of the People's Temple founded by Jim Jones. In 1978, over 900 of his followers, women, men, and children, died in a mass suicide murder ordered by Jones himself. The new movements and the rights revolution. Focus question: what were the sources and significance of the rights revolution of the late 1960s? Women and the rights revolution. The sexual revolution also contributed to the birth of the second wave of feminism in the late 1960s. The civil rights movement had inspired other Americans to express their grievances and claim rights. Many borrowed the militant tactics of blacks and students and adopted their language of, quote, power and, quote, liberation, rejecting traditional organizations and approaches. Women's suffrage had not ended women's lack of power and opportunity in the United States. When the 1960s began, only a few women held political office. Women were still restricted to traditionally female occupations, and major universities limited the number of women admitted. But a few feminist consciousness began to emerge in 1963 with the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Freedom criticized the emptiness of consumer culture and emphasized middle-class discontent, a byproduct of the 1950s consumerism. Her book portrayed talented and educated women trapped in a world in which they believed marriage and motherhood were their primary ambitions. Women's lives still revolved around the home, now a suburban home, which Friedan called a, quote, comfortable concentration camp. The book focused attention on feminist concerns. In 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, barring sex discrimination among those holding the same job. The Civil Rights Act prohibited inequalities based on sex as well as race. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission challenged barriers to women's employment. In 1966, the National Organization for Women, or NOW, was formed, with Friedan, the president, as a civil rights organization to press for equal opportunity in jobs, education, and political participation. A more militant feminist movement emerged from the civil rights and students' movements. Young women who embraced ideologies of equality and freedom and learned political organizing skills, once facing inequality and sexual exploitation within these movements, formed their own movements. Some white women in civil rights work drew parallels between the treatment of blacks and the treatment of women. In SDS, women protested their subordination and exploitation by male activists. By 1967, women were forming, quote, consciousness-raising groups to discuss the cause of their discontent. The movement began sensationally as the Miss America beauty pageant in Atlantic City in 1968, where women threw into a trash can, but did not burn, their bras. High-heeled shoes and copies of Playboy and Cosmopolitan were also added to the trash cans. New kinds of freedom. The women's liberation movement greatly expanded the idea of freedom by insisting that it should be applied to the most personal and intimate parts of life. These feminists, introducing terms like sexism, sexual politics, and the phrase, the personal is political, argued that sexual relations, marriage, and beauty standards were just as political as war, civil rights, and class tensions. They repudiated the sacred nuclear family of the 1950s and permanently changed Americans' definition of freedom. Radical feminists first campaigned for the repeal of state laws that denied women the right to terminate a pregnancy. They defined control over reproduction as the most basic of women's freedoms. This would later be taken to the national level with the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. But women's liberation's concerns went far beyond sexual freedom. Interests range from combating domestic violence to combating inequalities in the law, churches, workplaces, and the family. By 1970, feminist ideas were penetrating mainstream American life. Perhaps the greatest surprise of the 1960s was the movement for gay liberation. Gays and lesbians had formed societies in the 1950s, but these were not protest groups. Homosexuals faced stigmatization as sinful or mentally ill. Most states made homosexual acts illegal, and police harassed gays in major cities like San Francisco and New York. Most gays and lesbians kept their sexuality, quote, in the closet as a result. The 1960s, however, transformed gay politics. One moment in particular marks the beginning of gay liberation. The 1960 riot caused by a police raid on the Stonewall Inn in New York's Greenwich Village. Instead of complying with police as usual, gays fought back. In a few years, gay pride marches were being held in cities across the country, and still are to this day. Latino activism is somewhere else we see movement in the 1960s. In the mid-1960s, a new movement emerged among Mexican Americans that challenged their status as second-class citizens. Like Black Power, this movement emphasized pride in the Mexican past and in the Chicano culture born in the United States. But unlike SDS and Black Power, Latino activism was tied to labor struggles. In 1965, Cesar Chavez, the son of migrant farm workers and a disciple of Martin Luther King Jr., led nonviolent protests to force growers to sign labor contracts with the United Farm Workers Union, the UFW. The UFW campaign mobilized Latinos for civil and economic rights across the Southwest, and by 1970, the major growers had signed contracts with the union. In New York, the Young Lords modeled on the Black Panthers, held street demonstrations to protest conditions facing Puerto Ricans in the slums. Like SDS and SNCC, the Latina movement, with its male leaders and emphasis on machismo, inspired protests by women who call for freedom and equality for all members of that race of people. Indian or Native American militancy also emerged in the 1960s. Although the Truman and Eisenhower administrations had tried to dismantle reservations and integrate Indians into mainstream American life, many Indian leaders protested this move, and these efforts were abandoned by President Kennedy. President Johnson's programs gave some funds to reservations, but Indian activists compared the reservations to underdeveloped nations, and they demanded not just economic aid, but self-determination on those reservations. The American Indian Movement, founded in 1968, staged protests demanding greater tribal sovereignty and economic resources guaranteed in treaties. In 1969, Indians took over Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, claiming it had been illegally seized from the original inhabitants long ago. The protests, lasting until 1971, inspired the Red Power movement. In the 1970s and 1980s, many Indian tribes won more control over education and economic development on reservations. And Indian activists brought land claims and other suits demanding compensation for past dispossession. The environmental movement also came about in the 1960s and challenged foundations of American life, including the assumptions that progress meant endless growth in consumption, and the faith that science and technology and economic growth improved social welfare. The progressive era saw the beginnings of conservation and public parks, but the new environmental movement of the 1960s was militant, demanding that individuals have control over decisions that affected them. The affluence and mass consumption of the 1950s and early 1960s was now identified as the source of environmental degradation. In 1962, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, exposed to millions of Americans the effects of DDT, an insecticide used by homeowners and farmers against mosquitoes and other insects. Carson showed how DDT killed birds and animals and sickened humans. Chemical and pesticide companies tried to discredit her as a communist or as, quote, hysterical, but her work inspired the modern environmental movement. The membership of the Sierra Club, founded in the 1890s to preserve forests, skyrocketed, and soon groups across the country were exposing the dangers of water contamination, air pollution, and extinct species. Nearly every state quickly banned DDT. In 1969, a major oil spill on the California coast revealed the costs and risks of oil drilling and transportation. Despite opposition from business groups, which saw environmentalism as an infringement on property rights, the movement enjoyed broad support. Under President Richard Nixon, Congress passed a series of measures to protect the environment, including the Clean Air, Clean Water, and Endangered Species Acts. In April 1970, the first Earth Day drew the participation of 20 million people. The consumer movement, a close cousin to environmentalism, also flourished in the 1960s, inspired by Ralph Nader, who wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965. This book showed how auto manufacturers were producing highly dangerous vehicles. General Motors hired private investigators to try to discredit Nader, and when their efforts were exposed, GM paid Nader a large settlement, which he used to fund investigations of other dangerous consumer products, and false advertising. Nader's work laid the foundation for numerous state and federal laws for consumer safety. But many argued that these new laws limited one kind of freedom, especially private property rights, in the name of, quote, the greater good. The Rights Revolution. Although the Rights Revolution began in the streets, it won constitutional legitimacy in the Supreme Court, traditionally the most conservative branch of the government. However, that would change. Guided by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court greatly expanded the rights of all Americans and placed them beyond the reach of the legislative and local majorities. The Supreme Court's move toward protecting civil liberties and rights began in the 1930s, but was signaled in 1957 when the court started to check McCarthyism by overturning the convictions of individuals who had advocated overthrowing the government, who had not answered the questions of the House on Un-American Activities Committee, or had refused to state their political beliefs to state officials. By 1969, the Supreme Court had affirmed the right to hold unpopular views and dismantled the Cold War loyalty security system that had been put in place. In the 1950s and 1960s, civil liberties became integrated with civil rights. The Supreme Court protected the rights of private organizations to keep secret their membership lists and secured modern freedom of the press. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court continued to strike down numerous state segregation laws. In Loving v. Virginia in 1967, the court declared unconstitutional state laws that prohibited interracial marriage. The court in 1968 made illegal racial discrimination in the rental or sale of housing. The court also pressed states to respect civil liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It required states to abide by protections against illegal search and seizure, to honor defendants' rights to a speedy trial, and to prohibit cruel and unusual punishments, and secure the right of poor defendants to receive publicly supported counsel. Miranda v. Arizona in 1966 was one of the most important of these decisions, in which individuals were supposed to be made aware of their rights upon arrest, including their right to remain silent and confer with a lawyer before answering any questions to the police. The Warren Court also outlined entirely new rights in response to changes in American society. Most dramatically, it invented a constitutional right to privacy in Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965. This would overturn a state law banning the use of contraceptives. Although the Constitution nowhere articulates a right of privacy, Justice William O. Douglas, the author of the decision, asserted that privacy was ultimately the basis of all other freedoms, and that a constitutionally protected area of privacy within marriage could be inferred from the shadows of the Bill of Rights. The court soon made privacy a right of individuals, within or outside marriage, by ensuring access to birth control, and most controversially, by creating a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy in Roe v. Wade, 1973. This was seen as a major victory of the feminist movement and the source of major opposition to this very day. The rulings that followed Griswold and Roe seemed to accept the view that families were collections of individuals rather than a unit with a single authority. Women gained multiple rights within the family, including protection against rape and assault by husbands. 1968, the year of violence. Focus question. In what ways was 1968 a climactic year for the 60s? A year of turmoil within the U.S. The 1960s climaxed in 1968 when profound events happened so quickly that society seemed to be disintegrating before our eyes. In January of 1968, the Viet Cong in Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, which was multiple uprisings throughout South Vietnam that took major cities and completely surprised U.S. military leaders there. U.S. forces repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy losses, but the intense fighting, captured on television, eroded the confidence of the public in political and military leaders who repeatedly claimed that victory was not far off. Leading figures in politics and the press now criticized the war. Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war senator from Minnesota, announced he would seek the Democratic presidential nomination, and with the support of thousands of students, he won the New Hampshire primary. Lyndon Johnson, stunned by this, refused to send 200,000 more troops to Vietnam, as the Army had suggested, and he declared he would not seek re-election at that particular time. Peace talks began in Paris as a result. Martin Luther King Jr., at that same time, was organizing a Poor People's March on Washington to demand more federal anti-poverty programs. But, after traveling to Memphis to support a strike by black sanitation workers there, King was killed by a white assassin. The greatest outbreak of urban violence in American history soon erupted. Washington, D.C. was occupied by soldiers before order was restored. At the end of April, students protesting Columbia University's participation in defense research and its plan to build a gymnasium in a public park occupied campus buildings and were forcibly removed by police. In June of 1968, a young Palestinian nationalist assassinated Robert F. Kennedy, who was seeking the Democratic nomination as an anti-war candidate. In August, tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to protest the nomination of Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and Chicago's police widely attacked the demonstrators. The government indicted 8 radicals for conspiring to incite the violence, and after a tumultuous trial of the, quote, Chicago 8, several were found guilty. Their charges were overturned on appeal, however, given the flagrant bias of the judge. 1968 was a year of turmoil. The global impact of 1968 now needs to be discussed. The year 1968 was one of worldwide turmoil, not just turmoil within the United States. In many nations, young radicals confronted power structures, borrowing language and strategies from America's protest movements, and adapting them to their own circumstances. Television carried images of protests to other countries simultaneously and inspired them. Massive anti-war protests happened in London, Rome, Paris, Munich, and Tokyo, with great violence. In Italy, students occupied universities. In Paris, a nationwide student uprising that began in May 1968 echoed American students' demands. But in France, millions of French workers went on strike, demanding higher wages and workplace democracy in addition to the student uprisings. A general strike resulted that nearly toppled the French government. In communist Czechoslovakia, reformist leaders trying to democratize socialism were ousted by a Soviet invasion of the area. Troops fired on students demonstrating for greater democracy at the Olympics in Mexico City, killing more than 500. In Northern Ireland, still part of Great Britain after Ireland in the South achieved independence, the police attacked a nonviolent march demanding an end to religious discrimination, initiating an era of violence called the Troubles. Throughout the world, American second-wave feminism inspired women of other nations to protest for equal rights and citizenship. Women in Catholic nations such as France and Italy won the right to obtain divorce and have abortions. The book Our Bodies, Ourselves, published by Boston women dealing with widely misunderstood women's health issues such as pregnancy and childbirth, menopause, and birth control, was now translated into 20 different languages and spread throughout the world. The legacy of the 60s. Though 1968 was a year of radical protest, the year marked a conservative reaction as well. Social protests sparked calls for law and order, as things seemed to be getting out of control. Black militancy provoked white backlash, a growing force in politics. The Supreme Court's invention and protection of rights led to claims that distant federal bureaucrats were meddling with local traditions and states' rights. In August of 1968, Richard Nixon made a striking political comeback, and he actually did run for president and won the Republican presidential nomination. He campaigned as, quote, champion of the silent majority. Ordinary Americans who believed that change had gone too far and called for, quote, law and order. Facing a divided Democratic Party, especially since Johnson chose not to run, Nixon barely won a victory over Hubert Humphrey. Yet, George Wallace, running as an independent on a platform of resentment against civil rights, the Great Society, and the Warren Court, received 13% of the national vote. The Nixon and Wallace totals taken together showed that liberalism was in retreat. But 1968 did not mark the end of the, quote, 60s. The Great Society actually peaked under Nixon, and second-wave feminism surged in the 1970s with the growth of NOW. But Nixon's election initiated a period of conservatism in American politics. The 1960s did not produce a revolution, but it did revolutionize American life. It produced new rights and understandings of freedom. It allowed racial minorities to enter mainstream American life, although it did not solve urban poverty. It started to transform women's status. It made Americans expect new things from government, like clean air and old age medical insurance. But it also undermined public confidence in political leaders. Relations between the generations and between whites and non-whites, along with every institution in society, changed. The debates of the 1960s would live on in later questions and controversies. And as the nation became more conservative, the 1960s became blamed for many social ills. However, the United States became more open, more tolerant, and more free in this decade.